Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. On behalf of the South Asian Bar Association, the Federation of Asian Lawyers, the Canadian Association of South Asian Lawyers, the Law Society of Upper Canada's Equity Initiative Department, it's my honor to welcome you to this year's Asian and South Asian Heritage Month celebrations. My name is Radha Khosla. I sit on the board of directors for the South Asian Bar Association. I'm also a financial services lawyer at Denton's, and I will be your MC this afternoon. Asian and South Asian Heritage Month is an occasion to reflect on and celebrate the many social, cultural, economic, and political contributions that Asian and South Asian lawyers and Canadians have made to shape the strong, pluralistic, compassionate, and prosperous nation that we enjoy today. The celebration is a chance to take stock of the progress we've made and to refocus on the challenges that lay ahead. It's encouraging to look around this room today and see representatives from the private sector, the public sector, the not-for-profit sector, the academic world, and the community at large, bonded by a shared interest in promoting equality, justice, and opportunities for Canadians of Asian or South Asian origin in both the legal profession and the wider community. I'm proud to say that SABA, FACL, CASAL, together with the Law Society, have become the voice for members of the bar in Toronto and the GTA. Our organizations recognize the benefits of cultivating and advancing advocacy, community involvement, professional development, and leadership. To this end, over the last 12 months alone, either on our own or in partnership with each other, we've showcased our outstanding caliber of legal professions at our various awards ceremonies and galas, of which I know many of you have attended along with hundreds of others. We've designed and delivered various accredited professional development events. Through various networking events, we've created business opportunities and opportunities for open and inclusive discussions. We've marked notable historical events like the 100th anniversary of the Komagado Maru incident. We've been called upon to advocate for and against important issues affecting our profession generally. The TWU debates come to mind. Perhaps most importantly, stakeholders have sought and respected our input on numerous occasions with respect to issues that affect our members and the profession at large, and we take that responsibility seriously. Importantly, it's our valued partnership with the Law Society that's enabled us to put the issues of diversity and equality towards the top of the agenda. This partnership is built on a common belief that those that bring diversity to the profession also bring with them a diverse range of knowledge, skills, and experience that enables the profession to better understanding our ever-changing communities. While many law firms and organizations are boldly encouraging diversity and inclusion, there's still more to be done. There's no question that today there remains a disparity between the diversity of the Canadian population and its reflection in the legal profession. And so the question is, how do we achieve greater diversity? By the carrot or the stick? As you'll hear from our esteemed keynote speaker and various panelists, we're at a critical point in the journey towards achieving greater diversity within the legal profession. And so to unpack this further, it's my pleasure to introduce to you our keynote speaker this afternoon. Mr. David Sabucci is the Registrar and CEO of Ontario Colleges of Trades. Mr. Sabucci holds a Bachelor of Arts from York University, a JD from Osgoode Hall Law School, and an LLD from Assumption University in Windsor. Mr. Sabucci has served as the MPP from Markham for 2 terms and has held several cabinet posts in the Ontario Legislature, including Minister of Consumer and Commercial Relations, Solicitor General, Chair of Management Board, and the Minister of Culture. Prior to serving in the Ontario Legislature, Mr. Sabucci served as a councillor for the town of Markham. Mr. Sabucci has received numerous awards and honors, far too many for me to list now, but which include the Queen's Diamond Jubilee Medal, the Queen's Golden Jubilee Medal, the Bruce Bryden Award, and the Award of Merit from the Japanese Canadian community. Mr. Sabucci has been an international keynote speaker. He's a frequent lecturer at universities and colleges, and his memoir was recently nominated for the short list for the Speaker's Book Award. Interestingly, Mr. Sabucci has also appeared in a Cronenberg film. Without further ado, please join me in welcoming Mr. David Sabucci.
Thanks very much, and at some point in time I'm going to have to explain the Cronenberg thing. What I wanted to do is talk about my motivation for being so interested in diversity and inclusion. And that's actually the bulk of what I want to talk about, but I also want to talk about why I think it's important and also what we're doing at the College of Trades. Because, you know, you can't just talk about it, you've got to do something with your actions. And at least now I think we're in a position, and as we were just talking about, you know, as a new boy on the scene, we have kind of a blank sheet to work with. So we have an opportunity to do things that a lot of people that are far more established than us cannot do. And interesting enough, I just realized as I was sitting there that I think I'm the only visible minority who is a regulator in the province. So that's also an opportunity too. So I want to start with some background as to why this has such meaning to me as an Asian. And I start back with the Japanese-Canadian experience. And the Japanese Canadians in this country had to undergo an experience that not too many other immigrant groups have had to go through. And we've had to endure some circumstances that were very difficult at best. And you know, in the normal course of events, you know, someone will come to this country and they'll, you know, they, like my grandparents, and they come and they do a lot of labor work. So both my grandmothers cleaned houses for rich people in Vancouver. One of my grandfathers was a gardener for the same people. And my other grandfather, Tabuchi, worked out in the bush as a lumberjack. And they just try to make things better for themselves and for their families. The next generation usually gets involved with trade and business. The third generation kind of gets involved being professionals and getting into positions of power, maybe running for office. But we lost an entire generation in that opportunity when, during the Second World War, every man, woman, and child of Japanese descent was put in prisons. And I'll talk about that in a second. But I wanted to quote a gentleman I had the pleasure of knowing. His name is Bob Okazaki. Bob wrote a book called POW Camp 101. And I want to quote from this because it's relevant to me because my father was in that POW camp. Bob said, "The end result of the evacuation program was the complete eradication of our Japanese community from Canada's west coast. The evacuation dragged our community down into a whirlpool. While we were held back, other minorities began to politically and economically excel. Those of us who could have become leaders were oppressed and subdued. Now, some 50 years later, the Japanese-Canadian society I once knew no longer exists. Our forefathers were deeply humiliated, and their resent and anger will remain forever in their hearts, as sadly, one by one, they pass away regrettably and with pity." You see, before the Second World War, the Japanese Canadians and other East Asians, all East Asians, did not have the vote. They were barred from attending professional school in BC. In fact, BC was moving towards a segregated school system, one for the white community and one for everybody else. And everybody else meant Chinese, Japanese, South Asians. You know, two generations of the Japanese Canadians, the Issei and the Nisei, when they're imprisoned by the Mackenzie King government, and they're imprisoned for simply their ethnicity and their color. And see, not only were they imprisoned, but their homes, their businesses, their property, their money, personal possessions were all confiscated by the government and then kept by the government and sold and to pay for their imprisonment. So unlike the Japanese Americans, and I'll just give an example of how their Constitution gave them certain rights. After the war, the Japanese Americans, their homes and businesses and farms were kept in trust. So after the war, they were able to go back to homes. And if the farms were being farmed, the money that was realized from the crops was kept in trust for them. Here, when they were released, they had two choices. They said to my father, "You can either go back to Japan or you can go east, we'll give you a train ticket. No money, just a train ticket. My dad said, well, I was born here. I don't speak Japanese that well. I've never been to Japan, so how can I go back to Japan? And that was the dilemma they're in. Now, so this is the kind of headline that was there. Japs cannot vote. Slightly offensive today. And this is where the women and children were held before they're transported to these internment camps. And that is the women's dormitory, and that's at the, I guess, the Pacific Exhibition, I guess, like they had the CNE, they had the PNA, and that is the stock barns. So, you know, we're pretty clean people. We don't like to be around anything like that, and the women and children were in a place where they kept the cattle. And you know, I asked my mother about that. She really didn't like that, I can tell you right now. Another bad sign that we're in trouble is when you start restricting where people can go. And bearing in mind that half of this community were born Canadians. We're okay. So what happened was my father, he had the misfortune of living in Duncan, BC, so on the island. So in the middle of the night, he was visited by the RCMP, who told him that they had to leave the next day. They could take what they could carry, but they had to be prepared for the winter time too. And here's the dilemma. No one told them how long they'd be away, where they were going, are they going to come back? And so they packed clothes, and they thought perhaps they'd come home one day, which was never the case, and everything they had was sold or stolen. And they're treated like criminals, and yet that they had broken no laws. And shockingly, this was Canada. So worse than that, if you were a leader in the Japanese-Canadian community, you're considered a security risk, or if you're in a group of these protesters. And let me explain the protests they were doing. So in the States, they allowed the families to stay together during the transportation. So these protesters, which included my father and my two uncles on my mother's side, they weren't protesting the confiscation of all their property or their imprisonment or their transportation to these prisons. They were protesting the fact they wouldn't let the family stay together during the transportation. That was the issue. For that heinous crime, my uncles and my dad were put into a POW camp out in Marathon, Ontario. That's a scale model of the POW camp they're in. It was a real POW camp. And again, that's the internees, they call them, entering the Angler POW Camp 101. These are the huts. And actually, I just want to digress for a second, because the Japanese Canadians had nothing. No money, no power, no vote. We were the lowest of the low in Canadian society. And there was nothing for anyone to really come to our defense. Now, politically, there are two groups that did. The CCF, which was the precursor for the NDP, and John Diefenbaker, who was a conservative. So, you know, people ask me why I became a conservative. Well, Mackenzie King government took everything away from us. But this is a funny shot that they had a band. Some of these guys, what they carried with them when they left their homes were instruments, believe it or not. And the fellow who is the third from the left is my uncle, Hideo Takahashi, who happened to be one of their camp recorders as well. And he was telling me that they had no music. And one of the prison guards, his name was Private Stonefish, his First Nations man. He said to my uncle, "My daughter's finished with the sheet music. I'm going to bring it in and give it to you." Now, first of all, if he was caught, he'd been in trouble, because that's fraternizing with the prisoners. Secondly, if anyone who ever plays music, I mean, I still have music I played when I was 12 years old. You're never going to go back and play it again. So he was doing it because he was a good person. Amazingly, the other person who was kind to the prisoners, my uncle, the other uncle, Akira, this is northwest Ontario, in the middle of a blizzard. So when you're walking in a blizzard, what do? You've got your collar up, you got your hat down, you're walking, trying not to get the snow in your face. But the protocol in this POW camp, because they're not military people, was if they saw an officer, they had to stop, take off their hats, and bow to the officer instead of a salute. Well, it's the middle of a blizzard. My uncle and his friends did not see an officer walk by them. They're charged with insubordination. And they thought, we're done. It's our word as prisoners against the word of an officer. And they came before an officer, his name was Captain K. And Captain K was another First Nations man. A very high rank during the war for him to have achieved. And he dismissed the charges. Years later, after the war, when my uncle was in a subway station, he saw Captain K, and he went up to thank him for what he did for them, and he didn't remember it. Apparently, he just was a fair man and did that for everybody. But I wanted to share an extract. This is my biggest motivation, oh, here. The funny thing about being in this POW camp was, what were the prisoners doing? Well, I find it ironic that they were improving their martial arts skill. And so in this picture, the second from the left is my dad, Kiyoshi Tabuchi, and he actually ended up being one of the top kendo masters in the country afterwards. They're always hungry, obviously, but on the back, it's not in color. You can see on the back of the prisoners, there's it's a red circle. And when one of them said to my father when he just came in, he said, "Isn't this nice? They got the flag of Japan on your back." And my dad said, "That's the target they aim at if you try to escape." Anyway, this is my grandmother, Suga Takahashi, and my grandfather, Chozo. And what I want to do is share with you a story. And this is an excerpt from my grandmother's diary. And this is really the story that really had a huge impact on my life. And this is my grandmother's words. My 52-year-old husband, Chozo, had been ill since October of 1941. And in January 1942, it took a turn for the worse. At that time, we had all but given up hope that he would ever recover. However, during the latter part of February, his condition improved somewhat, for which we were very grateful. On April the 13th, while out for a stroll, he was stopped on the street by a Mountie and hustled off to the immigration building. On April 21st, word leaked out of the immigration building that my husband was very ill. I immediately hastened to the BC Security Commission to obtain a special permit to visit him. My request was flatly denied. I then went to the RCMP headquarters, but also with no success. I decided to go to the immigration building, with or without a permit, was able to speak to the sergeant for permission to speak to my sick husband. I asked him. He replied, "I have no authority to allow you to do that." In the meantime, I learned my husband's condition became worse day by day, and finally the authorities had decided to transfer him to a hospital. I went to the immigration building and I asked, which hospital will he be taken to? He was sent to the Essendale Mental Institution. But he's not insane. The doctor knows that. Why do you want to send him there? There's no room at Vancouver General Hospital. After much haggling, it was agreed that he would be taken to the Vancouver General Hospital. With that problem settled, my daughter and I requested and obtained permission to see my husband. What we saw was beyond belief. In a dimly lit cell, my husband was lying forlornly on a cot on top of a single army blanket and nothing else. Why even a cat or a dog will receive better treatment? Gazing at the pitiful sight, I couldn't stop the tears from running. I wondered how anyone could expect to get well in such a dismal surrounding. Is this their idea of humane treatment? On April 24th, he was taken to Vancouver General Hospital. During the 6 days he was in the hospital, I was able to visit him, but the door to his room was always bolted. On April 26th, I met with Dr. Dobson of the hospital and said, since I'm able to provide good nursing care for my husband, I would like to take him home and care for him myself. The doctor said, if you take him home now and later on you wish to have him readmitted, you will not be allowed to do so. Is this agreeable with you? I replied, Once I have him home, I will not bring him back here. However, my attempt to bring him home failed, although I was able to extract a promise from the doctor, he will not be moved out of the hospital without your permission. In the early afternoon of April 27th, I received word that the Security Commission has given us approval to have my husband taken home. I should go to the hospital either at 3 p.m. or 7 p.m. When I arrived at the hospital at 3 p.m., I was informed that they had refused my request, and consequently my husband could not be discharged. The following day, I went to see Dr. Hodge in the Hastings Park Manning Pool and explained the conflicting stories. His reply was that the timing was not good, but I could probably take him home in 2 or 3 days. In any case, he added, he will not be taken from the hospital without my approval. On April 30th, when I went to visit my husband, I was told by a nurse that he was transferred to the Essendale Mental Institution. How could they do this to me? Why should he be sent to an insane asylum? He isn't crazy. What about the promise that he would not be taken out of the hospital without my consent? I went to see Dr. Hodge and demanded an explanation. All he would say was, that's as good a place as any to recuperate. On May 2nd, my son Akira and my daughter Kazuko visited him in the mental institution, and although no evidence of inadequate treatment was noted, my husband was deemed to be a dangerous element and therefore not even permitted to see the movie, as did the other patients. As a form of exercise, he was compelled to wash the floors, which he found extremely tedious. In the eyes of the doctor, my husband was considered to have recovered. He was returned to the immigration building on May 13. Concerned about his father's well-being, my second son, Akira, requested the Mounties be allowed to be with him. The request was granted, and Akira therefore marched into the immigration building. On May 16th, my husband was placed in a train with other inmates to be taken to the prisoner of war camp in Ontario. Akira was also on the train to watch over his father. I'm sure he found some measure of comfort in that fact alone. Furthermore, my eldest son, Hideo, had been previously arrested and sent to the POW camp in Ontario. I was confident that Hideo would look after his father as soon as he arrived there. I was waiting for the opportunity to correspond with him. At 4 p.m. on May 23rd, tomorrow, I guess, 2 Mounties knocked on my door and said they were bringing bad news to me. They said, Takahashi became ill on the 18th, was taken off the train in Winnipeg, hospitalized, and died at 1 a.m. I was stunned to hear the news. If he was so sick, why couldn't they have notified me? I asked, what was the cause of death? Natural causes, but if you want the body brought back, you have to pay the cost. I don't have a penny to my name, but I want his body sent back. If he had died in any of the road camps, then the government would accept responsibility and send him back to you, but since he was an internee, we can't help you at all. Will you put that in writing? You can't help me? We can't do that. We'll bury him in Winnipeg. I told him to wait and immediately contacted a friend and arranged to borrow some money. Arrangements were then made to have my husband's body sent home. Receiving information my husband's body would arrive at the CNR station on May 27th, my friend offered to go there and bring him back. A short while later, he returned empty-handed, saying he didn't see any casket being unloaded. Did my husband actually die? There followed some moments of anxiety and uncertainty. It wasn't until much later I learned that an undertaker had taken the body directly to the funeral parlor. A funeral service attended by just a few friends was conducted the next day, and cremation followed. It wasn't until the end of the war when I learned that at the time my husband was taken off the train in Winnipeg, my son Akira had pleaded to accompany him, but this was denied. With sadness in his heart, Akira had no alternative but taken to the POW camp in Ontario for the duration of the war. That's my grandmother's story. And on top of that, she spent the remainder of the war in an internment camp called Limit Creek, and after the war, she raised her other 5 children as a single mother. And you know how hard that is today. Well, you can imagine what it was like then. My grandfather died en route to POW Camp 101 and became the first Japanese Canadian to die because of the internment. But you see, as I'm a third-generation Japanese Canadian, so they call it Sansei. So as a Sansei, I wanted to know about this experience, what happened. And none of the Japanese Canadians of that generation, the Nisei, wanted to talk about it. It was almost as if they were ashamed this happened, but it wasn't their fault. You know, when the Second World War ended, the road to recovery was not easy. No one would hire them after the war. They got to Toronto, and it was only through the help of the Jewish community. They were the only ones who would hire the Japanese Canadians in Toronto. And by the way, this year, our Sakurado Ball, which is our big gala for the Japanese Canadian community, we're doing two things, but we're honoring the Jewish community for them providing us with the only job so we can work after the war. But you know, I still remember a picture of my father walking down the street in Toronto, confidently holding his head up, and I thought, you know, that goes against all the beating down that they had received over the years. But you know, after the war, as we continue on, this is just about, again, another bad sign when you start carrying ID cards. These are the deceased internees. You can see that second from the bottom is Chozo Takahashi, my grandfather. At the age of 55, he was the first person to die. If my grandmother had not brought his body back, they were going to bury him in a pauper's grave in Winnipeg. This is a drawing of the POW camp. And my two uncles, Hideo Takahashi and Akira Takahashi, both young men. My father was POW number 606. That's just a statement. What does somebody do when, where does he go when he loses his home and his livelihood? These are some of the accommodations, tents. Lemon Creek. This is typical of the place they stayed, and there's no privacy. Several families into one of these huts, heated by only one stove in the middle. They were uninsulated in the middle of the winter. It was very cold. And if you're a modest person or a modest ethnic group, it was very bad. There's Lemon Creek again. That's where my mother was. And this picture, top row, second from the right's my mother. She learned to play the piano so they can play. See, people ask about religion. It depends on who the missionaries were to the various internment camps. So if the missionaries were Catholic, they became Catholics. In this case, they're United Church missionaries, so that's why my mother brought us up in the United Church. And others, they're Buddhists, so we're a mix of different religions. After the war, actually, that's not my dad, that's me. So, yeah, I was little once. But you know, we had a number of challenges after the war, and we didn't have much. By the way, that stage, that wasn't our Christmas tree, by the way. Our neighbor across the road was an amateur photographer and took the pictures for free in front of his Christmas tree. But you know, I always say that we had no money, but we weren't disadvantaged because I had a good family. And that to me was the greatest factor in my life, was getting ahead, was having a good family. And in fact, just digressing, on Christmas, that Christmas, I was 4. You know, here's a good example of how a good family makes a difference. So my grandmothers sent me underwear. Grandmothers did that in those days. My uncle, Stan, worked for a company called Zenith Electric as a TV repairman. And they had a special on that if you bought a TV, you got a free, shiny, cardboard punch-out space helmet. Now, we didn't get a TV, but I got the free helmet. And my mother and father went down to Kresge's and bought me a little toy radar that sparked for a dime. So they spent a dime on me at Christmas. But I didn't think I was missing anything, because my parents had a determination to make it seem like we had the same as everybody else, but we didn't. But that wasn't even the problem. I mean, like I said, I had a good family. The challenges we had as I grew up were, I turn the slide here. So here's an example. That's grade 1, but it wasn't a lack of money, and it wasn't even the name calling and the overt prejudice and the bullying that I had gone through as a kid. It was more the feeling that I was an outsider. And here's the perfect example. This is my grade 1 class, and you can note that I am the only visible minority in that class. Not unusual then. That's my grandfather, Tabuchi. This is my grade A class, and you can note I am the only visible minority in the class. It was more of the feeling of being an outsider, being raised in isolation. And it was a conscious decision by the Japanese Canadian community not to locate more than one family in any neighborhood, because you can't see us, you can't put us all in jail. Simple. And we're told, you know, be more like Canadians, integrate. I spoke no Japanese at home because they didn't want us to have an accent. You know, we keep our heads down and to fit in. But even though you tried to fit in, you're still an outsider. You know, you're excluded from many things. But you know, this became a big motivator for me as I grew up. You see, when you have nothing and you're excluded, you can do one of two things. And my dad always said, you got two choices in my family. You can either sit in your behind and complain about it, or get off your behind and do something about it. And no one in my family was sitting there behind doing nothing. And it became a motivator for me. I didn't want to be the same as everyone else. I didn't want to be equal to everyone else. I want to be better than them. I want to show them that I was better than them. That was my motivation for doing what I did. And the other problem about not having anything is your life is, this little box is your life. My dad was a dry cleaning presser, my mother mended clothes. So we didn't go to the movies, we didn't go to restaurants, we didn't go to art exhibitions or anything like that because we didn't have the money. So, but I knew somehow that I wanted to do more than be a dry cleaning presser. I knew I wanted to do something, I didn't know what. And this is when I discovered libraries. And I think, I always say the library is the greatest institution of democracy because it doesn't matter how much money you have, what color you have the same rights in a library, and you can learn. And I went in, and by the time I was 7 years old, I'd read every biography in the library because I didn't want to know what they did. I knew what they did when they became famous, like Thomas Edison, you know. I want to know, how did they get there? What do they do as young people to get to where they got to? That's why I want to read biographies. And the libraries taught me there was a real world around ourselves, things that I could possibly do with my life that I never thought were possible. And that's where I got my motivation from, is from the libraries as well. Now, going into high school, let's see if we got, what's the next one? I can't remember. Oh, that's our grade 8 hockey team. Again, I am the only who's minority. And believe it or not, I didn't know what the hell 4 meant. I wouldn't have picked that number today. Certainly not as an East Asian. Oh, that's later on. Okay, so when I went to school, so we had a few strikes against us. I'm the only visible minority in the school. We don't have any money. I'm ahead in the school, so I'm the smallest and youngest kid in the school, and of course I did well in school, so that's another strike against you going in there. But fortunately for me, later on, I was a decent athlete in my school. I was athlete of the year in my school, too. I played football and hockey. And my determination, it wasn't I had great skills. I just had a lot of determination to do something in my life. My brother was a better athlete. I said he had 2 things I didn't have playing hockey, size and talent. My brother's like 6'1", he played hockey at 225 pounds, and he was drafted by the Penguins in 1975. So late round pick, but I never could do that. So we had an easier route. He got a hockey scholarship down the States. But I made a deal with my father. He made a deal with me. He said, any money you earned on your own, I could keep and use it the way I wanted to do. So when I was 10, 11 years old, I did everything I could. I shoveled snow, I cut lawns, I got a paper route, and what I spent money on was this. My clothes were always neat and clean, but my clothes were the furthest thing from cool you could wear to school. And I wasn't trying to get really cool clothes, I wanted to get clothes that weren't so odd. So when I was a little boy, I spent my money on clothes so I could fit in better. You know, I couldn't do it about a lot of other things. I couldn't do the fact that I was a minority or I didn't have any money, but I could do something about that. You know, and the challenge was, here's my university picture, York University. And I went there, by the way, because I always thought York University was a university based on meritocracy, and a place that was better for me because there are no sororities, there are no fraternities, there's no elitism. So I could do things on my own without, you know, knowing somebody, which I didn't know anybody. But you see, my father's philosophy was, because the government put him in jail and took away everything he had, he said he'd kill himself before he took a penny from the government. And that's great for my dad, but it meant for me, I had to have a full-time job while I was in school. So I was in university and law school. I worked a full-time job driving a forklift truck. The good news was I didn't have to be in class to get good marks, but I needed the money, and that was a challenge. Now, I was lucky, though, because well, this never came out when I was in politics, thank goodness, because this is in 1972 when Team Canada was playing against the Russians in the big summit. So we decided to name our team in Osgoode after Team Canada, sort of. And we call ourselves Team Cannabis. And that's a marijuana leaf. And all these guys are prominent lawyers and judges now, by the way. And that's me with a big Fu Manchu in the front row. And I had hair once upon a time, too. That's my graduation from law school. Oh, I'll tell you this story. So when I met George Takei, he's a friend of mine now, by the way, I said, "You changed my life." And he said, "What do you mean?" He said, "Well, before Star Trek, everyone who played an Asian in the movies and TV was either some white guy spoofing it like Mickey Rooney, right, at Breakfast at Tiffany's with buck teeth and lisping. Or you're an evil war criminal like Fu Manchu, or you're a war criminal. Nothing good. No, we were either mocked or made to be look like we're villains." And then Star Trek comes. And Star Trek, George Takei, Mr. Sulu, was a hero. And he looked like me. And all of us, like in those days, my parents said, fit in, become a Canadian, and yet be proud of who you are, but their actions spoke exactly opposite to what they're saying to me. And he comes along, and he looks like me. Well, you know what? It's cool to look like me. You know, he was a role model to me in that funny way. I was lucky to meet George later on in life, and that's at his 70th birthday party. And he's a great raconteur, and I admire him as well because of his activism. He was he's the chairman emeritus of the Japanese American Museum. He did an awful lot for the Japanese Americans, and I'm actually chairing the fund to raise money to build the Japanese Canadian Museum. That's how we got to know each other. But he's also a great advocate on behalf of the gay lesbian community in the United States, and I admire him for that, his humanitarian efforts. He's a great, wonderful guy. But you know, I was lucky that my mom and dad were alive to see me. That's my mom and dad. They were alive to see me elected. I was the first Japanese Canadian to be elected to any office in Canada when I was elected to Markham Council. I was the first Japanese Canadian to be elected to any legislature in the country and to be a cabinet minister. And apparently now I'm the first regulator in Ontario who's Japanese Canadian. My parents got to see that. Unfortunately, my mother died at the age of 68 when she was in the Lemon Creek internment camp. She developed pleurisy, and then later she lost a lung, and I put that at the feet of the Canadian government. My father was killed 8 years ago by a hit-and-run driver. But the good news out of that was this. The day before he was killed, I was actually being honored by the Japanese Canadian community, and my speech was all about my father, about what he meant to me as I grew up. And it's very rare you get a chance to express yourself to your parent what he meant to me. So we're lucky in that way. But you know, despite the barriers that he faced and the prejudice and theft by the government, he always said he had one goal in life, and that's to wake up the next day to make life a little better for himself and his family. You know, we all have to live our own lives, but I remember my father, he never accepted the limitations that other people would put on him. But he also always led every day with a determination to do something better. And that's my motivation for thinking that and believing that diversity is so important. I want to share that because it explains why I think we need to live diversity and inclusion, because having been an outsider, having been excluded, and believe me, back in the 50s and 60s, the prejudice was a lot more overt than it is today. You know, I'll just tell you quickly before I get into the serious part that when I was 6 years old, I got beaten up at school. I came home, and my mother gave me sympathy. She was a saint. My father came home, and my father was not a big man. My dad was about 5'4", maybe 130 pounds. But to me, he had, I don't know, it was like Zeus, you know. I never disobeyed my father. I never talked back to my father. And he came home and he said, and by the way, you cannot do this today. This is not advice I'm giving anybody. He said, you go back tomorrow and punch somebody in the nose. And I said, Dad, they're older than me, and there's more than one, and they're bigger than me. He said, I don't care. Stand up for yourself. Now, I have to admit, I was afraid. I was scared. I went back the next day, and I got pushed around, and I hit somebody, and I got beaten up again. I came home. My mother gave me sympathy. My dad came home and said, you go back tomorrow and punch somebody in the nose. For 2 weeks, I went to school. I got beaten up, but I hit somebody. And finally, I hit somebody hard enough. He started to cry, and it stopped. And he said, I told you to stand up for yourself. So, you know, it is true, but you can't do that today. You can't do violence to violence, but I tell you, it did stop. But, you know, what disappoints me is we're having this conversation, this discussion about how to achieve diversity. You know, it's in many ways it's like a discussion about how to achieve integrity. You know, the really successful organizations in the private sector, in the public sector, institutions, they understand the importance of integrity. You know, you just think of the corporate examples, like Johnson & Johnson, the Tylenol incident, where they recalled all the Tylenol, even though it was just one shipment, which gave confidence to the public and gave them a trusted brand. IBM is a trusted brand. Another company I used to be on the board of, Teranet, their whole motivation was to create an organization of integrity. And when the organization believes that, the management believes that, the staff believes that, the public believes it, your customers believe it, and you have that trusted brand. So diversity is not much more different than that. I mean, diversity and inclusion, it shouldn't be the goal. It should be the way of life for a business, for the government, for everyone. And if you want to boil it down to, I mean, look, if you want to boil it down to crass economics, that if you have this culture, this belief in diversity, then it has a huge marketing advantage. I'm astonished that the corporate sector has not figured this out. That, you know, look at, we're in the majority in the GTA right now. It's a huge market. You can use that to say, and I had this conversation just today with a young lady who is with the Korean consulate. I told her the story I had with the Japanese companies. And I said, you know, you are trying to do business in Canada, but the Japanese companies do not have, and Japanese, have a reputation around the world that's welcome in all parts of the world because of past history. And they have a reputation for being efficient, but not necessarily liked. And I said, you're doing business in Canada now. And actually, I had this conversation with the Japanese companies, through the Shokokai, which is all the CEOs and presidents of the Japanese companies and the embassy. And I said, you're trading on the reputation of the Japanese Canadians, who have a very good reputation in Canada. They're good citizens. And after the war, despite what happened, they don't have a resentment. I mean, my generation, the sons say, we resented it. We were mad about it. We're the ones that made the difference. But the Nisei fit in to become good Canadians. And law-abiding people, hard-working people, most of us are overachievers too, but the fact of the matter is the Japanese companies are trading on our reputation in this country. And so I said, it's time for you to reciprocate this. You should show somehow to the Japanese Canadian community that you respect what they've done for you and get them involved corporately in executive positions, and because it's your obligation. But secondly, if I'm just a company marketing stuff, and I got people who are working in that organization, either on the board or at the executive level, to me that's a tremendous marketing opportunity. Plus, culturally, you get to understand a lot better about what this whole thing is about and understand your market, what they need, because you're that bridge. We also bridge that gap between you as a foreign company and Canadian culture, because we are in between the two. And that's a huge opportunity. But unfortunately, you know, I've sat on a number of boards of directors, corporately, publicly traded companies too, Teranet, Income Trust, Hitachi. Well, Hitachi is different because they're all Japanese on that, but any other public or private company board I've sat on, I'm the only visible minority on that board. And by the way, there are no women. So there's no Asian women on there either. You know, so there's a lot of work to be done in these areas, but at the end of the day, I think quality, if you have quality, and this, I say that diversity and inclusion is quality. The people don't necessarily want to buy the cheapest thing out there. They want to buy something of quality and brand names involved with that. I think this is part of the branding that we need to really push to make sure they understand this and get, I mean, it's a no-brainer to me, but then again, you know, I have a different perspective, I guess, than some of the old boys clubs that are running these areas. But you know, I've seen a lot of change in the world since I started. I mean, I experienced overt prejudice when I was growing up, where it was a distinct disadvantage to be an Asian. It was. Trying to get a job. Look at, you know, we just talked about this before. Like, when I graduated from law school, and I'll tell you how old I am. I graduated from law school in 1975, and there weren't a lot of Asians who were lawyers. It was tougher to get a job. I mean, I had to work 10 times harder than anybody else to try to get an interview. You know, it wasn't necessarily based on your merit or your ability. You know, and the world is still quite that way too. It's who do you know? You know, but it was harder now. You know, and there's so many barriers still. Here's the two principles of boards of directors. Who do you know? And you eat what you kill. So there's so many people out there that have qualifications to get on these boards. So you've got to provide a reason to get on there. And to me, the reason is networking. Your ability to network both into your own community, but also in the community at large, because you create yourself a value to them. A value in, again, you have to work twice as hard unless you know the CEO or president of the company. You know, it's really hard. Now, the good news is, as we get there bit by bit, you're going to get more and more people that are Asian, visible minorities, who get into positions of executive positions and on boards of directors. And I think most of them have the same attitude as I do, that, you know, having experienced the way my life has gone and not having anyone to help me at all and trying to make my own way, I always think it's my obligation as an Asian to help others to get to that position. And as we get more people to those positions, I think it helps. So I think it's evolving, but the world's got to change a lot faster than that. You know, at the end of the day, you've got to take advantage of mentors. I had no role models or mentors. But there's no reason why people around here do not have that ability too. So that's kind of why I think what I do. Now I'm going to tell you what we're doing a little bit. And I'm fortunate today, I'm joined by Sandeep Tatla. And Sandeep, wave or stand up. Sandeep is the Chief Diversity Officer for the Ontario College of Trades. I think he must be one of the very first ever. And it's a credit to the current government because this was mandated, but you know what? I would have done it anyway because I think it's important to us. I mean, and here's some, and the key for us, and I'm going to use a lot of your words because Sandeep is a very smart woman, so I'm just going to steal some of her thunder here. But the key to any successful diversity work is to tie it to your organization's strategic goals. But more importantly, you have to live it. You cannot just do lip service. And I know the topic is the carrot or the stick, but you know, it's got to be deeper than that. It's got to be an ingrained, deep belief and confidence, and this is an important thing to do. And if you have that decision made to the management, it just goes through the whole area, I think. And you know, in the trades, because we're responsible for the trades today, and that's what one of the concerns we have, is that in the trades, here are the underrepresented groups. Women at 3 to 5%. Visible minorities, 5 to 7%. Immigrants, 3%. Now, I know we're a room of lawyers, and I talked a lot to schools these days, and I said, you know, it's an opportunity for many new Canadians to get into the trades. And I'm an East Asian too, so all of our parents want us to be professionals, doctors or lawyers or accountants or something. But not everyone's suited to be a doctor, a lawyer, or an accountant. And in the trades, you can, be apprentice, make money, and you don't come out of it with tens of thousands of dollars in debt, which I'm sure many of you have out there. And so there's a real advantage. It's a great way to run your life too. Our guiding principles. First of all, we need to understand the issues of underrepresentation in the trades. We need to address the barriers in recruitment, retention, completion. We need to integrate people trained in other jurisdictions. So this is very important to us. And we're moving towards this now. We're taking over the functions right now of qualifying trade credentials from the Ministry of Training Colleges and Universities. And part of what we need to do, because we have a lot of new Canadians who have skills in their own country, we want to give them the opportunity. So we want to make sure that sometimes the language is the barrier, sometimes it's the written examination based on the language here. So we want to make sure that they have an opportunity based on experience to be able to participate. It's important for us to be welcoming, and we need to have that trained workforce here, but we need to give them opportunities, not be barriers. And we need to raise the awareness of this underrepresentation with our stakeholders. And more importantly, our staff, our management, we need to understand and respect the values of diversity and inclusion in everything we do. It has to be the first thing in our mind when we think about these things. And it takes a while to get to that point, but if you start thinking about this as your first thought, it starts to happen. Not an afterthought, not making lip service, but it has to be in your conscious thought you need to do these things. You got to believe in it. I mean, the good news is that we believe in it. And those that don't will believe in it. But internally for our people, our commitment is a diverse and inclusive organization that enables employees to reach their full potential, delivers excellent service to our membership, and advances diversity amongst the trades. So our goal is not simply for our organization to promote diversity and inclusion. It's to do that amongst all the trades. And we're responsible for 156 different trades. I think there's close to half a million of those in the province. So I think it's another way we can make a difference, not simply in our own organization. But important to all this, we need to build leaders within our organization too. And we're lucky that we have, Sandeep has been conducting a number of talks with our leadership and our staff, and I think very successfully so. But we need to make sure that we have the leadership all believing this too. So this is all about the culture, and I'm not going to just go bit by bit through this, but we have a 2-year plan for all this right now. What we want to do is make sure we deal with the awareness. We need to understand this. We need to talk to our stakeholders. But if we don't have our stakeholders involved with this issue, all the trades, whether they're unions, whether they're non-unions, whether they're employers, and we need to have them all believe in this with us. And it starts with us. If we don't believe it, how the heck are they going to do that? It starts with us. We have to walk the walk, which is very important to us, and I really do thank Sandeep for that. But here are some little statistics that in our senior management, 38%, this is an Ontario College of Trades, this is us, 38% are women, 25% was minorities. And I took an informal poll today as I walked around before I came here with other staff. I walked around and I discovered that we have, other than English and French, we have the ability to speak 30 languages at the College of Trades. That to me is one heck of an asset. If we can communicate with people who call into us in their own language, that's a tremendous thing to have. And if you walked around, not just senior management, if you walked around the Ontario College of Trades, you could see that we're walking a walk right now. And it just happened to be that way because they have merit. People need to know that they have no barriers to advancement. They have abilities to do that based on merit, based on fairness, because I know I've been there before where it wasn't based on merit, nor on ability. And that's a hard thing to overcome. So again, you know, my life colors the way I look at this, but I think we have a tremendous opportunity at Ontario College of Trades. And if we can set an example, it's good for other organizations too. I plan on us being very successful in this area, and for people to look at us and say, look what Sandeep has done for us, and look what the organization has done. Because if we can do that and show that we are successful, then we do set the table for others to do that. So that was my long-winded approach to this. I went over time, I think, too. But do you have time for questions? Oh, sorry.
Thank you very much for that thought-provoking address. We have a couple of mics set up in the room, and we'd be happy to take questions from the audience if there are any.
That's me at 4.
Well, as you all know, we'll be transitioning shortly to a reception upstairs, and Mr. Tabucci will be there. So if you do have questions, by all means, please approach him then.
Okay, thank you.
And we'll continue the discussion at that point. Thank you. At this point, we'd like to transition to the panel portion of our program. Lai King Hum will be moderating our panel session. Lai is the president of FACL, that's the Federation of Asian Canadian Lawyers, and has been an active member of that organization since 2010. Anyone who knows Lai, which I think is everyone, knows that Lai is committed to actively advocating to ensure diversity in the profession and to raise the profile of Asian Canadian lawyers. Lai is called to the bar in Ontario and Quebec and has over 10 years of experience at top-tier firms in both Montreal and Toronto. Lai recently founded Hum Law Firm, a boutique practice in downtown Toronto offering legal expertise to deal with all aspects and all issues arising in the workplace and the regulation of professions. Lai, would you please take it from here and introduce our panelists? And I'll invite the panelists to please join us.
Thank you, Radha. And is the mic turned on? Please have a seat. Well, it's a hard act to follow David Tabucci and his inspiring presentation, but we are going to be discussing the topic of the evening, which is the carrot or the stick, how to achieve diversity. We, as evidenced by David's inspiring presentation, the journey to greater diversity has been a very long road. And it's been a while since the days when Asians and South Asians were actually barred from becoming members of the bar. And as you may have seen when you walked into the Law Society building, there are banners in the hallway that discuss the history of Chinese Canadians and the head tax. But it also highlighted the fact that it was only in 1945, fairly recently, that an Asian became a lawyer. He was called to the bar at the Law Society of Upper Canada in 1945. So it has not been that long. And the issue today is not, can we become lawyers? But the issue is quite a bit more nuanced. Yes, we can become lawyers. We can become members of the bar. We can be hired by law firms, and many of us are hired by, in government. We have become members of the judiciary. But the numbers are small. And many in this audience will have questions. Well, how do we get ahead? How do we become partners in law firms? How do you become general counsel in-house? How do you get appointed to the government? How do you become a judge? The stats that we know of are fairly, maybe dismal is a bit harsh of a word, but I'm going to use that word. The stats are fairly dismal. We have with us a very distinguished panel all of whom have expertise in diversity and inclusion issues. To my immediate left is Sonia Mack. Sonia is a partner at Borden Ladner Gervais, and she is also chair of its Diversity and Inclusion Committee. As the chair of that committee, she is also a representative at the law firm Diversity and Inclusion Network. I always get that one mixed up. Next to Sonia is Melissa Kennedy. Melissa has some happy news, actually. She just became have you started the job yet? No. Okay, so she is soon to start a position as general counsel at Sun Life. And she is currently chair of the wonderful organization Legal Leaders for Diversity. Melissa will talk a little bit about that later. To her left is Ratna Omidvar, and we all know the Maitree Foundation. She is the president of Maitree Foundation, and the Maitree Foundation is well known for its work in diversity and inclusion, and some of you may have attended some of the seminars that are put on with respect to public appointments and diversity in the profession. To her left is Lisa Wong, and Lisa Wong is counsel in the corporate compliance and risk corporate compliance group at BMO, Bank of Montreal. And for those of you who know, Bank of Montreal is considered to be very progressive in its diversity efforts amongst private corporations, amongst the business community. So Lisa will talk a little bit about that, I hope, as she answers some of my questions. The format of this panel is really more of a discussion. It will last about an hour, and I will get the ball rolling with some questions, but we invite questions from the audience. I'm hoping for a very lively discussion and ask that you join in. So, in order to get this all rolling, we might want to know what it is that we're really talking about. So my first question is a very basic one. And the basic question is whether the legal profession will have better success, A, using the carrot. And by that we mean by encouraging or persuading law firms and other organizations of the benefits of diversity and inclusion. Or would it be better to use the stick? And by that we mean using harsher measures, such as refusing to retain law firms that do not take positive measures about diversity. So let's start with Sonia to my immediate left. I'm going to ask for very quick answers for this preliminary question, so maybe 2 minutes.
Okay, thanks, Lai. This is a difficult and complex question, and the scope is very broad as well. In my personal opinion, I would choose A, carrot. To use David's terminology, ingrained belief, I think we will all do better to achieve diversity and inclusion if we can develop and culture an ingrained belief in the value of diversity and inclusion. And that can be achieved better by encouragement rather than imposing a stake. Because the problem of imposing a stake, in my mind, is there's a risk of having diversity just for the sake of diversity to avoid the stake. Have I used up my 2 minutes?
That was a very good, concise answer, and probably less than 2 minutes. Melissa?
Thank you very much for asking me to participate. I think it's a combination of both, and if I could describe it, it's more of a nudge. We at the Legal Leaders for Diversity, I think it's a combination of the two things. Just to give a little background about the group, we are a group of 75 general counsel for Canadian companies across Canada, which have signed on to a mission statement, if you will, and seeking to promote diversity and inclusiveness in the legal profession. It was founded 3 years ago by 6 of us, the general counsels. I am at Teachers currently, pension plan, of the general counsels at Deloitte, RBC, BMO, and Kellogg, and at Xerox. We got together and thought, you know, we've got influence in the legal community, and particularly with law firms, and to be blunt, because we are significant purchasers of legal services. So we know we have a lot of influence by that alone. We'd like to think it's because we have something else to add, but we do have a lot of influence with the law firms. We thought we're at a stage in the game where, you know, let's do something to help move it. And what I found particularly attractive of this organization is initially it was an organization of a diverse group of people from different backgrounds saying, let's do something about it. Which I thought was great, and we've grown to have now over 75 general counsel from Canadian companies across Canada. But I think it's more of I would describe it more of a nudge, where you have people who say, you know, this is important to us, so start to do something about it. And you just keep holding the flashlight up to say, okay, what have you done now? What have you done now?
Well, thank you, Melissa. So now we've got a carrot, we've got a nudge. Ratna?
Well, as the only non-lawyer on this panel, I'll beg to differ with the 2 speakers who've gone ahead of me. I think sticks define the floor, carrots aspire to the ceiling. So you need a combination of both. Let's take a look at a similar question in another jurisdiction, the employment equity legislation, which governs Canada's national employers, has been instrumental in ensuring that visible minorities, women, disabled people, etc., have a better chance at getting hired by those employers. Now, because they are there, they have now over time moved up into the pipeline. When you look at diversity and leadership in the corporate sector, it's pretty, it's not great. It still stands at about 6%. Based on certain indicators. But when you take a look just below and into the C-suite in Canada's corporate sector, you will really see, it's quite amazing, the diversity of the leaders of tomorrow. And I believe that has come about as a result of, one, the carrot, the stick, which was employment equity legislation. You will not be able to function as a national employer in this country without meeting those requirements, and then those people sort of moving up the ladder. So I would say it's a combination of, you know, the work that Melissa's group is doing is outstanding, but there is another group, again, made up of lawyers. It's called Action for Canada?
Call for action.
Call for Action.
It's a US-based.
It's a US-based group which works within the legal community and uses the stick. So I think it's a combination of both that will create the change.
Thank you. And Lisa, what is your answer to this question?
Thank you. I'd like to pick up on something that Melissa said in terms of the organization that you're with, because Simon Fish, who is the legal leader within BMO, is also part of that panel. And what she said was influence. So influence from corporations. And as you mentioned, Lai, BMO has taken a leadership role in terms of diversity initiatives. And as an example, what BMO is doing in the Legal, Corporate, and Compliance Group is more of a business-led approach. So it's more towards the carrot. And as part of the engagement process for legal suppliers, BMO requests information on the firm's diversity profile and uses this in its selection of legal counsel. And we do have hiring lawyers that ask for this information. And so the law firms are aware of this. And so by providing this information, it gives BMO more of an idea into the diversified nature of the law firm supplier. And that in and of itself is encouragement, and more than encouragement, to show how serious this is to the leadership team. And also in terms of economics and business-led, if there's more information and the lawyers have that that information to at least evaluate different suppliers, it's a factor. So I think it's being used in that context of BMO.
Thank you. And I just want to alert everyone that Ratna has another appointment after this discussion, so she may be leaving sharply at 6:30, did you say? So I'm going to put her a little bit up in terms of the questions, and I'm going to put her on the spot right now. And Ratna, you've heard from Sonia, Melissa, and Lisa on their views on whether the stick or the carrot is better, and there's been nuances in their responses. But I noted that in your question, you had said that at the national level for certain employers, it required the stick, the Employment Equity Act, in order to get the ball rolling. So in terms of, in this audience, we would be talking about law firms and corporations. What kind of stick would it take to get the ball rolling?
Well, I think I'm not going to imagine what those sticks are, but you come from a highly regulated sector. You know, you have your governing bodies and your laws, so I think it would be pretty easy for you to imagine some sticks that are easy to implement. I would go for low-hanging fruit, and so what I would suggest is that all law firms should be required by the Governing Council to report out on the visible minority status of their firm. Let's include women in it, let's include other designated groups in it, but they should be required to report out on an annual basis, not just who is there, but where they are at. We did some research in 2011. We focused particularly on the legal sector in Ontario because lawyers are so important. How many lawyers have gone on to become prime ministers in this country is also very, very important. And we found, we took a look, and this was 2011, we designated roughly 2,410 individuals in the legal sector in the GTA. These included judges, people on governing bodies in law schools, partners in law firms, and crown and deputy attorneys. And in a city jurisdiction where 47% of us are visible minorities, your share of legal leaders came out at 6.8%. We have done this once. It is not up to a private foundation to continue to. We've sort of put a template out. I think it is up to the legal community to say, we are going to repeat this, we're going to measure, account, and report out. Because without measurement, there is no accountability. Without accountability, there are no resources. So I would say that's a stick that you would choose.
That's very interesting. For some of you may be aware that there is an effort to persuade the Law Society to make it mandatory to have firms or even lawyers to report on progress. And the lack of statistics is a weakness in terms of any advocacy for further diversity. And you may find it surprising to hear that in the States they do keep statistics. There are various organizations, for instance, the American Lawyer keeps an annual diversity scorecard that tracks major law firms and the percentage of minority lawyers and also the percentage of minority partners. We don't have anything quite like that here. And what we understand is that in the United States, Asians and South Asians are the largest minority group entering the legal profession, but also are the lowest minority group in terms of numbers to conversion to partnership and or general counsel positions. So I would be interested in hearing from Sonia and from Melissa about what your firm or what, let's say, the Teachers Plan is doing to support more transparent reporting or providing that kind of evidence in order to increase diversity. Sonia?
Yeah, maybe I'll start. At first, I want to respond to the comment made by Ratna and Lai about data reporting. For myself, I think there's merit in data reporting, but I don't think that we should be just bogged down by the data, because it's just a snapshot of the situation at a particular moment. What we should focus on is how to analyze the data. Why is it the way it is? What are the issues? How the issues can be addressed? And just by like showing the data and be bogged down in it, I don't think is as effective. To use an example, what I understand in UK, there is a statement issued by the Law Society of England, where about what they call like 400 magic law firms being signatory, and they produce annual report each year, not just on data, but on their initiatives, on case study, on the issues they come across and how to tackle those issues. It's not just large firms, medium-sized, small firms as well. So in response to like whether there should be transparency in data, this is my view. Now go back to the second question, what BLG has done in this regard. We have been tracking gender diversity for a number of years, showing progress, etc. But we haven't been, we haven't performed a real demographics data and inclusion survey as such, but we are going to do that next month. So for that, we are going to, this is our first one, and we are going to do that on a periodic basis to see how it progresses. Also have some outside service provider to help us to analyze the data from the inclusion question to identify whether there are any issues. And that, I think, will help management and our committee to resolve any issues if there are.
And if I could just ask a quick question, what is the position of the law firms for Diversity and Inclusion Network say about the efforts like this? Okay, I call it LFDIN to make it easier. The LFDIN, as a number of you may know, is a group of about 18 law firms, which was a group formed last year after attending the Summit of Legal Leaders for Diversity and Inclusion. And we have issued a statement of principles. BLG is one of the founding signatory. And what we are committed to do is not just to promote diversity and inclusion within our firm, but also in the legal profession. And what we have meetings almost on a monthly basis, and all the law firms' representatives sit together. We talk about what are the best practices, what are the obstacles we have encountered, why we are doing that, and also like what are the current issues, etc. And most recently, I think LFDIN and LLD are going to have a joint project, and that is setting a mentoring program for associates of diverse background. So the LFDIN, in my mind, is a very big step in the legal profession, because when you think about it, all our firms are competitors in business, but all of us see the value of achieving diversity and inclusion in the profession, and we are prepared to work towards that objective by working together. Okay, thank you. And I'm going to just go to Lisa for a minute. And can you tell me, is BMO collecting statistics as well?
From the law firms?
No, within.
Oh, within, yes. Yes. So BMO does collect statistics for its employees, and the information is on BMO's website for public viewing. Oh, I just wanted to mention one thing about the numbers and the metrics that was brought up from a few panelists. So in terms of numbers, Absolutely. I think I'm not sure, personally, how you measure without numbers. You're going to go from point A to point B, and you need a point of reference, even if it is at least starting from one point. And I say numbers not just because I practice tax and my father-in-law is an actuary, one of the first actuaries in Ontario, actually, but because I actually do think it matters. So just wanted to start with that. So in terms of just some of the programs that BMO has for diversity, you want me to just run through? Okay, so I'll run through a few. There's a lot. There is a lot of description on BMO's website under investor relations. First, I think what is a very important program is tackling cultural blind spots. So the very senior top leaders of BMO attended an in-depth course about training on how to identify unconscious bias and hidden blind spots. And the point of that is if you don't know that you have a bias, it's hard to address it and get over that. And this is also to help them make fair decisions about hiring, develop, and rewarding employers. So as the top leaders, I think that's very important that they're addressing this issue. As well, the leaders, senior leaders in BMO, I think 400 this year, are set up to take in-depth classroom training, and employees also have these resources and videos available to talk about cultural issues. BMO has also introduced workforce representation goals and initiatives, and for each business group, and it introduces key diversity segments, and the goals are tracked and reported quarterly to the group heads and the leadership teams. And just very quickly, I'm running out of time. Within LCCG, just want to mention 3 items. For recruitment, there's a recruitment guide which embeds diversity principles, and also what I think is interesting is it suggests, but I think I have seen this done in practice, at least 25% of the candidates have to be from diverse groups, and that's adjusted from time to time. And that's communicated to the external hiring firms and also internally. And I have seen it work where the hiring manager goes back to the external and says, that's nice who you gave me, I need some more people to take a look at. Supplier diversity, I mentioned that as well, is that BMO does request diversity statistics and does use them in the selection process that's available to the hiring lawyers. And last all, the employees in Toronto and Chicago in the legal group, they act as mentors for various student programs through LAWS, which is Law in Action in Schools, and Working in Schools program.
Okay, thank you. That's very interesting. I didn't know that BMO was taking so many initiatives.
There's lots more, but
okay. And I'm going to go to Melissa, and just quickly, having heard what BLG is doing and what BMO is doing, what position does the legal leaders for diversity take on data collecting and the initiatives taken here?
Well, no pun intended, we are a very diverse group of people, so I can only speak for my own personal opinions. I think data is important. I think you have to be a little careful sometimes with data to ensure that the stats aren't gamed. But I agree with Lisa. It's hard to measure progress unless you start to measure. So we have been encouraging the law firms to come up with some kind of reporting. Either formally or informally, we haven't taken it so far as to make any submissions to the Law Society. But we think it's easier to see, obviously, progress that's being made. One of the things that we really wanted to see was, quite frankly, we looked at ourselves internally because we all have, varying sizes of law departments at the various corporations that we're at. BMO would have a very large one. Teachers has a smaller one, but we just anecdotally, when we were discussing the original 6, we said, our outside law firms are not looking like us. And it's not that we as corporations don't have lots of work to do on diversity and inclusiveness. We do, don't get me wrong. But it's just they're becoming more and more homogeneous, and the internal legal department is more diverse. And so, do they know they don't look like us anymore? And it's a little disjointed. And the hiring, I over the years I've hired quite a few lawyers, and I remember at one point in time when I was at one job and I was hiring quite a few lawyers into a legal department, And somebody sort of said, kind of a teasing joke, I think, said, you know, your last 4 hires were all women. You know, what's going on, Melissa, building this little empire of women? And it's just like, no, they're not making partners at law firms, and I'm cherry picking. This is getting easy. Because they're going kind of 6 to 8 years and they're not making it, and you know, so of course I've hired men too, and have hired men, but you know, it's just that the law firms are not providing opportunities. There's a couple things I'd like to address, you know, about diversity and inclusiveness in the law firms. And one is, of course, it's the right thing to do. To have a diverse group of people, it's just the right thing to do. That's a no-brainer. But what I really don't get about law firms, and I was a partner in one for many years, I don't get that they don't understand the business case. I really don't get it. And you know, I've been in the financial sector my entire career, and it's just such an obvious business case. From the point of view of you get a far superior product, legal solution, whatever you're doing, when you have a diverse group of people thinking about it. That's just kind of obvious. It's fun to hang out with people who are exactly like yourself because you relate so well. You know, that people are human and natural, and that's how a lot of this skewing can happen. But if you're all thinking the same way, you end up with the same solution, and that's just not the best solution. Rarely is that ever the best solution. And the other issue that I really don't get with the senior partners is like they train them, and then they don't, and then they let them go because they go in house. It's great. We hire them, so they get trained 6 to 8 years. And I've had this discussion with senior partners. Is that I'm becoming the competition for them, for their younger associates. Because, yeah, I don't really want to hire below 6 years because in-house is not a good training ground. You kind of have to hit the ground running. So, yeah, I'm just kind of waiting for, you know, the next crop to come up. And I don't understand your business model because a whole bunch of resources are being put into, you know, the different communities, be it Asians or South Asians or gays and lesbians or, you know, people of women, etc. Lots of resources go into educating us, training us, and then the business model doesn't somehow have us promoted. I just don't get it. So that's one of the messages.
That's a really passionate response.
Yeah,
and
I'm very passionate about it. It just, to me, it's just an obvious business case.
And
the right thing to do.
I just wanted to make a comment on the context of diversity. It's different in different jurisdictions. So when you talk about the United States, the word diversity in many ways is code for African Americans because of their history. In this country, I believe that the word diversity, which is about so many different kinds of diversity, is code for gender equity. So when corporations in particular say we have diversity initiatives, I believe that they are, for the most part, and I'm a woman, we're all women, I would like to believe that when a rising tide will lift my boat too. That's what I'd like to believe. But I don't believe that is the experience of minority women per se. So I think we have to be diligent in this conversation to disaggregate diversity and understand its context and its lived experience for different groups of people. I was at a session the other day. I'd never been to one of these, and I was really very enlightened by senior leaders in corporate Canada who are gay. And we had the same conversation. Their challenge is that whereas you can look at our kind of diversity quite clearly, it's visible, theirs is not as much. So they find it really hard to measure their influence, their participation, and all of that. So I just think that, especially, and I've worked a lot with RBC, or, you know, all of these corporate entities who are sincere about diversity and inclusion. It's really important to remember to disaggregate the information and disaggregate your strategies based on the demographic that you are trying to reach.
So would you,
I just-
Melissa's dying to say something, so I'll let you say something.
I really, really agree with you. The one thing I've learned and I've loved about this group that I'm involved in is exactly that, is in looking at the different issues, be it gays and lesbians, people of color, women, be it whatever background they are. It's completely different strategies. You know, sometimes it is a pipeline issue into the law schools, and you have to start even at the high school level. You know, with people, particularly people of color, who just don't think about going into law school when they're in undergrad or even from high school. For women, it's not a pipeline issue into law school. I think the last stats I heard, women were more than 50%. But yet, 40 under 40, it's still 20%. So somehow we get really stupid about 15 years later. So I totally agree with you. Totally different strategy. You can't just paint it with one brush.
So would
very
we,
complex.
and this is open to any one of you to answer, do you think that there are certain phases in terms of barriers? So certain barriers have come down for certain groups or diverse groups, but are still up high for other groups?
Yeah, I want to get back on the comments. I think both of you have touched on two very key aspects of diversity. Just on the business case, I think that's a very valid point. And the first thing which our committee did when it was set up is to provide training to our management why there's a business case to promote diversity, senior management and middle management. I think that's very important because we basically carry on the business of which we call the practice of law is a business. The second is focusing on gender diversity. Yes, when people talk about diversity, we focus on gender, and that's not the only type of diversity. So what we have done is that we encourage people of different diverse groups to form affinity groups to help us to understand the issues relating to different groups. For people like me, who wasn't trained here as a lawyer, what are obstacles? How do we achieve that? People like LGBTA, which Ratna mentioned, like they will have different perspectives helping us to achieve better diversity.
Thank you. And Lisa, do you have anything to add?
I think it's all been said.
Okay.
What I do find interesting about diversity is that it's not just what you can see. And I think that's the issue. When the first thing that comes to a lot of people's minds when they hear the word diversity is something you can see. So gender or visual minority, but I think it's a lot more than that. And I agree that there are issues that are deeper than just what you can see that need to be addressed.
Okay, and I've seen quite a bit of passion being displayed here, and I'm wondering, are the barriers that you see where you cannot understand why senior partners don't get the business case, as Melissa said, do you see the barriers as systemic?
Well, it would depend what we mean by systemic. I think in our report, by the way, which is on our website, it's 2011, but it still holds good. Some of the systemic barriers that are noted are the way lawyers are absorbed into the system. The articling continues to be a challenge for many young lawyers, visible minority or not. Articling positions are declining in scope, in numbers, because of the changes in the profession. So I think that is a systems barrier. You cannot become a lawyer without articling, as far as I know. And now there are some proposals on the table by the Law Society and others to adjust to that. So I think those are systems barriers. But then there are entrenched barriers that are more barriers of the mind. Someone spoke about unconscious bias. There's a very interesting research study that's come out from Harvard University that says people exercise their unconscious biases, not against someone else, but for the like-minded group. So it's proactive discrimination towards people who you identify with, and without making,
Without
gross-
malice, without
Yeah.
malice.
not without malice. So,
Yeah.
which means that the people who've gone to the same school, who've lived in the same neighborhood, who maybe look like each other, I don't want to make gross overgeneralizations, but that's where newcomers, people who look different, people like David, get left out. That was maybe conscious bias in your parents' generation. That was really horrific. I was really moved by that. And thank God our laws, our floor, has come so much further that that would be simply impossible to imagine in Canada today. But the ceiling of enlightened minds that accept, that are truly inclusive, that's the ceiling that we want to aspire to.
And is this study, the Harvard study, is that also on your website? Do you have a link to it?
Dr. Banerjee, she's very famous. Dr. Masarine
Yeah.
Banerjee,
Okay.
she's very well known.
She's,
Anyone can.
yeah, she's an excellent speaker too.
Absolutely.
So if anyone gets a chance to hear her speak or read her papers, she's phenomenal.
Okay. So I see people taking notes of that, the
And I
Harvard
know
study.
some of the law firms have, to that point, taken deliberate steps in their recruiters to take training in unconscious bias when their legal recruitment, recognizing that that is in fact what part of human behavior.
We're trying to scope out a research project with Corporate Canada around anonymizing job applications, because it's all the research tells us it's the name that is the first barrier that people get screened out. So what if we anonymized names and took away indicators in the resume, languages spoken, schools that you went to, and simply looked at competencies and credentials and said, okay, would that help people get screened in?
That's quite interesting, and there's been a lot of media coverage on similar types of studies. Yes, and in fact, I think the Human Rights Commission, the Ontario one, made a suggestion in terms of foreign trained professionals to eliminate the country of origin on applications, so for a similar reason. So on the question of whether there is systemic or unconscious biases, Melissa, do you have anything else to add?
No, I believe it exists. I'm a real fan of learning, and I come from a family of teachers, so we used to talk about pedagogy at the dinner table. And I put my poor lawyers through a number of different kinds of testing just to see where we all are. And I found it really, there's a kind of testing that you can do that basically says how do you work with other people, how do you learn? Which apparently doesn't change from when you're 5 years old to when you're 105. It's just how you relate in the world and how you work with other people and how you solve problems. And I found, although I had hired diverse people in the classic sense, I had hired people in that framework of how you learn, which is great when you're talking strategy, but I actually need a few process people to help me, execute on some ideas. So I found just on that basis alone, although I was conscious of diversity, I was framing my first few hires at one job were people who thought like me. Yeah, so yeah, I believe, definitely it exists.
Okay, and Lisa, you want to add something?
Yeah, I just wanted to add something in terms of, I guess, the systemic issue. It's not necessarily conscious decision, let's just say the senior management or the partners not to promote perhaps racialized candidates. And I think that's where the trap is. If they're not conscious that they're making these decisions, favoring certain candidates that perhaps look like them or think like them, then it's hard to overcome this and get more people of diverse background because it's not a conscious decision. And I think in a lot of cases it isn't. And so what Melissa said, also Radna, is the training. It's getting them to understand why they're making these decisions, and that's perhaps holding the best talented candidates back.
And Sonia, you've been nodding all along. Do you have anything else to add?
Okay, on the systemic barrier, which Ratner mentioned about articling the articling whether it's a systemic barrier. It is, but I don't see how we can remove this barrier. Just like doctor, before they can be a doctor, they have to go through internship. On unconscious bias, I think this is, in my mind, quite a big issue. Nowadays, I don't think any of us have any conscious bias. We consciously discriminate not in the positive sense, but in the negative sense, other people. But all of us have some unconscious bias, which we are not aware of. So to tackle that problem, I think most important is that we should be conscious that we can be subject to unconscious bias. And to achieve that, I think we should always be thinking of this as a potential issue. We can have like more education, more training, like the Harvard paper. I think that will be very enlightening.
Okay, thank you.
I want to give an example of how you can adjust systemic barriers. A few years ago, a brilliant lawyer from India called me. She had completed her master's at Western. She had not qualified in Canada. She was not getting an articling position, and so she was not going to be able to practice. And she was a specialist in intellectual property rights. And because of who knows who, and this is a lesson, who knows who matters, we were able to connect her to an internal champion at Denton's and another internal champions at Deloitte. And between those two, they brokered an articling position. You will have her for so many months, we will have her for so many months. They got it approved by the governing council. Every time I run into the managing partner of Denton's, he wants to give me a hug because she is so bright. So I think there are small pilots one could adapt, and I would suggest that this organization put its mind to what are some of the ways articling can be adjusted without lowering the bar. I think that is an important question. And submit a paper to the Law Society and say, this is our point of view.
That's great. There was a lot of debate about what to do about the articling process, and that was over the last couple of years. A decision was made by the benchers of the Law Society to have a parallel program for those who could not get articling positions. So I'm going to start to wrap up. I know, Ratna, you have to leave. Do you have time to just answer one quick question? So what is the one key thing that members of minority groups can do to improve their chances and take advantage of opportunities that exist?
So I would say to you, and I'm not becoming mother, be the best lawyers you can be, first of all. Be the best you can be. Second, as part of being the best of you can be, who you can be, you must expand your networks. Our research told us that one of the reasons that visible minority lawyers do not get ahead is because they do not have access to powerful networks. David talked about boards, and I want to put forward a simple proposal to you. We run a project at Maitree called Diversity on Boards. We have a huge database of candidates who are qualified, trained, assessed. These are not tokens. There is a huge demand from not-for-profit, charitable, and public institutions such as the Royal Ontario Museum or the Hospital for Sick Children for lawyers on their boards. Look up the website, get connected, because it's those board relationships that are the broad social networks, and this is really, really important for you to do.
That's great. And do you have? Okay, we're going to thank Ratna for. Oh, you're okay. All right. So in that case, I'm going to throw one more question at you. What is the one key systemic problem that the legal profession has to tackle?
Well, I think we've talked about articling, so I'll move on to another idea. I do think it's important to have measurements and metrics and reporting and accountability and analyze. Obviously, numbers by themselves don't tell the full picture. You have to analyze, you have to propose recommendations, but that has to be done.
Okay, well, thank you. And I'm going to pose the same two questions to the other panelists. I'm going to go to Lisa now.
Well, I think you said, you kind of stole my thunder, because that's exactly what I was going to say. But what I want to talk about in terms of the one key thing that an individual can do, and it's incorporating what you said as well. And I know everybody's heard of this a lot. It's mentors. But I don't mean mentors as in look at your company directory and call up a person necessarily and say, hi, will you be my mentor? And yes, that can work as well. How I think mentors work effectively is by being a good lawyer, by doing really good work and making sure you get good work, by asking for it. And when you do good work, people can recognize you, and that's how you can get somebody's attention who's in a senior leadership position, who takes you on transactions. You do great work, they keep giving you more work, and then you get yourself like an unconscious mentor who takes you with them when they're with the clients. You get the networks and moving up that way. So I think through doing great work, being a good lawyer, asking to be included in the big deals with the senior partners, that's a way that someone can help themselves on that. And the systemic, I think she said it all. I think metrics are important, and tackling the subconscious or unconscious bias within organizations, because, as I mentioned before, if you don't know you have it, it's hard to fix it.
Okay, thank you. And we go to Sonia now. What is the one key thing that members of minority groups can do to improve their opportunities, and what is the one key systemic problem that the legal profession has to tackle?
Okay, as you can see, I'm one of the minority group. I'm a member of the minority group, so I'm going to speak from my experience, and I can have the benefit from the other two speakers as well. I would say one key thing which we can do is to be proactive in integration. The system and the system has some work to do. We can also help ourselves as well, help others to include us, understand us, and I think that's something which we can do. For the system, I think the system can help by helping us to tackle the problem on a coordinated and effective manner. My experience, particularly in the recent years, is that a lot of law firms want to do something. We think that something should be done. But if we have the system or Law Society or the Canadian Bar Association, if they can help us to coordinate that efforts, I think it would be more effective.
Okay, thank you. And Melissa, you get to have the final word on that.
Okay. I think one thing, and this is not specific to the South Asian group, but quite frankly, something that I've been encouraging all lawyers to do, and that is, I find lawyers as a group, I find us, we're very risk averse, and any risk-taking aptitude we may have had was absolutely hammered out of us in law school. And that's good, because our clients rely upon that. They want us to see all the risks and help them and protect them or advance their interest. And so that is our job, and that's fair. The problem is that sometimes becomes who we are. And what I see about lawyers is sometimes we're really, really afraid to reach out. And I would encourage anyone, be there whatever background, to reach out to others. And the idea of mentoring, I think, is key. I think it's really key. It's one of the reasons why my group, the Legal Leaders for Diversity, has asked the law firm Diversity Initiative to partner with them. We want to be mentors for younger associates who are from different backgrounds, and it's up to the law firms to figure out who would like to participate. But for us to be sort of a safe environment to talk to some of the things, either as an Asian, South Asian, or as a woman, or as a parent, as a, men, young males have the same issues with parenting as, a colicky kid's going to keep both of you up. So we want to provide, a safe kind of environment for you to bounce things off. There's a bunch of us in the in-house jurisdiction that are quite eager to do that. So I think the suggestions of networking either through boards, because it really is worth working with other people that you figure out, yeah, so-and-so is a good egg. You should hire them or work with them because you've worked with them either on a project, a board, a particular deal, or a particular initiative. I think those are great suggestions.
Well, this has been a wonderful discussion, and frankly, I think we could go on and just keep talking about the topic. But we're going to open it up for questions. There are 2 mics, and if anyone has questions to any one of these panelists except Ratna, please step up. Thank you, Ratna. Please, just step up to the mic.
Thank you very much, President Tom and the distinguished speakers. I am a law student from Osgoode, and I'll be leading the Asian Law Student Association next year. When I first came to law school last year, and I realized I was told by the senior students and the schools that the law school is actually a very racial and discrimination neutral places. But as the year moves on, and when I talk to many of my peers and some RPS students, and I think that there are many concerns, especially on the bias, especially some unconscious bias pops up almost every day when I was talking with them. And as a result, in the next year, we're going to pursue a racial and discrimination awareness agenda instead of the neutral agenda. So my question is, what kind of messages, is a general question for all the panel members, what kind of the messages would you like to convey to the new law students, the Asian law students, especially the first year, because we are going to convey some messages next year to the new student. And what kind of the role do you think that we as the Asian Law Students Associations can play throughout the process? Thank you very much.
That's a tough question. Who wants to tackle that one?
Well,
Melissa is...
I think it's leadership. I think you yourself are taking a leadership position within the law school. And you are going to be the role model for the new students who are coming in. So I think by ensuring that the agenda is changed or enhanced or fostered or what have you at Osgoode to ensure that it is a rich place to learn without that bias, I think you're doing exactly the right thing, and you are the leader for those new students coming in. And make sure it stays on the agenda at the school.
Also important to do some research. There's a lot of information out there put on by various law societies. There's a good article from the Law Society of BC about biases and unconscious bias. And I think it's important for individuals to recognize, especially within the legal profession, that they exist. And so when people are communicating with other lawyers or perhaps looking for an articling position, just to recognize that there are going to be barriers, and then how to overcome them is the challenge. But as long as they recognize that there are systemic issues within law firms and other organizations.
Yeah, and I think like for the recruitment people in the law firms, I think it can help if all of these people have got some training and education on how to avoid unconscious bias when they interview like students, when they interview associates.
Okay, great. I think we're running long on time now, and but I'm going to see if there's one more question, and then we'll end. Okay, so Jayshree, come on up. Jayshree, for those who don't know, is the president of the South Asian Bar Association.
Thank you, Lai. First of all, thank you. That was a great, great panel discussion. It was very encouraging to hear the different things that your organizations are doing and the different thought processes, the research that's been done. But when I look at all the panelists, I see members of mainstream organizations. I see leaders of very visible, very, well, again, mainstream organizations. But most of the lawyers in Ontario are employed by or are working in or are part of smaller organizations, smaller firms that are outside the microscope. And I'm just wondering, what can we do? When I say we, the Law Society, members of the profession, organizations such as FACL, SABA, etc. What can we do to reach out to leaders of smaller firms, mid-sized firms, smaller companies, to kind of, shake them out of their, perhaps their indifference or their ignorance about, the importance of diversity? What are your thoughts?
That's a very good question. When the LFDIN was formed last year, this is one of the questions we ask ourselves. Because like all the representatives are all from like major law firms. How can we reach out to medium-sized or smaller law firms? We haven't thought of an answer yet, but that is on the agenda of LFDIN. The other aspect is that like even for big national law firms like us, there are like variation in the degree of enthusiasm in promoting diversity in different offices. I would say like the Toronto office is like most enthusiastic about it, and that, but other law offices, they know the importance, but maybe less enthusiastic than the Toronto office. So apart from like reaching out to law firms of different sizes, the other thing we have to do is to reach out to different provinces across Canada as well.
I'm not sure I have anything really more to add. Our group predominantly deals with the larger law firms, I'll be quite candid. And that's where we have the most amount, that's where we have the influence, is that's where we buy our legal product from, if you will, is with the larger law firms. I know it was certainly a question that we had, because we were trying to encourage the law firms to form a group. We kept inviting them to our summits to form a group. We said, well, should it be everybody? Should it be? And it was, just, it's a big elephant, you got to bite it a little bit at a time. So that was our answer. I don't believe that's the final answer for you, because you're right, there's so many other legal participants in the legal field than just certainly the law firms and the big law firms in the big cities.
Well, at least as a first step, I think that's an area we all recognize needs to be worked on, which...
Absolutely. No, you're absolutely right.
If I could just add a little something. As demographics and population changes and there's increased communities that aren't English speakers or mainstream, as we might say, then there may be a natural market for smaller, medium-sized firms to want to engage lawyers of diverse background in order for business, just like the large firms would make a business case for it. I think that it has to be make them aware that there's a real business case for being able to serve certain communities that aren't being properly served. Lisa.
There's one interesting aspect of the supplier diversity questionnaire is that perhaps not all of the firms on the list are the large ones. and as the supplier chain is quite diverse for a large institution, I think that brings opportunity, that the hiring lawyers are seeing suppliers that perhaps they never would have thought of because their diversity metrics are higher. So I think that's an opportunity. I know it's not a full answer, but at least they're starting to make inroads into not just using the firms that we would assume have the most diverse population.
So that was an excellent question. Thank you. Okay, well, I want to thank the remaining panelists. That was a wonderful discussion. Thank you, Sonia, Melissa, and Lisa.
I'll pick up on that, Lai. To each of our panelists, your commitment to diversity is encouraging. You've certainly given us a lot to think about, and probably more importantly, some great ideas to take back to our respective organizations. To you, Lai, thanks for moderating such an engaging discussion. On behalf of the Law Society, SABA, FACL, and CABLE, I thank each of you and Mr. Tabuchi for your time, your candor, and your insights this afternoon. I'd also like to extend a special thank you to Andre Brazeau of the Law Society, to Jayashri Goswami, the president of SABA, to Sandeep Sandhu, the vice president of SABA, to Lai, the president of FACL, to Raj Sharda, the past president of CASAL, for putting together such an excellent program this afternoon. I invite you all to join us for a reception, and I'll ask Andre to lead us to the reception area. And at that point, we'll turn the program over to Raj Sharda, who will take us through the next phase. Thank you.